Hi, good evening. Welcome to the 48th Institute on Ethics in Journalism at Washington and Lee University, birthplace of journalism education in the United States. My name is Edward Wasserman. I hold the Knight Chair in Journalism Ethics here at W&L. And what happens in this auditorium, what will be happening for the next hour, hour and a half, is the public part of a much longer and more arduous educational undertaking. The Journalism Ethics Institute, the creation of my predecessor and mentor, Professor Lou Hodges, consists of a seminar today and tomorrow in which students from our capstone journalism ethics class join with a distinguished group of journalists and academics, the Institute Fellows, to wrangle over the rights and wrongs of cases that the Fellows bring along. That seminar takes up about 7 hours. I know I can hear your disappointment that we haven't invited you to join us for that as well. But I do want to take a moment to recognize these fellows and thank them warmly for coming here. These are absurdly busy professionals, and for them to take the time to join us is truly a mark of conspicuous gallantry. So I could ask each of them, please, to stand and wave and be seated, and then I'll ask the audience to give all of them a round of applause when I'm done. First is Caesar Andrews, who's coming off a 30-year career with Gannett Company, the country's biggest newspaper chain, most recently as executive editor of the Detroit Free Press, who led the Free Press to the 2009 Pulitzer for Local Reporting. Caesar's my colleague this term as Reynolds Distinguished Visiting Professor here at W&L. John Karras. John is an award-winning and highly prolific producer with CBS News Sunday Morning in New York, where he has produced more than 150 stories. Michael Gettler, currently Ombudsman for PBS, the public broadcasting system, was a reporter, foreign correspondent, and editor for the Washington Post for 26 years, then executive editor of the International Herald Tribune in Paris, poor lamb, then ombudsman for the Post. Arlene Morgan, associate dean at the Columbia Journalism School in New York. She joined in the year 2000 after a 31-year career with the Philadelphia Inquirer, which in her day was one of the country's truly outstanding news organizations. John Watson, associate professor at American University in Washington, specializing in communications law and journalism ethics. With both JD and PhD degrees, John became an academic after 21 years as a journalist in the northern New Jersey, New York City market. Reed Williams. Reed covers police and courts for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Virginia's leading newspaper. Formerly, he was with the Roanoke Times and the Charlottesville Daily Progress. And Corinna Zarek, of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press in Washington, where she heads up the committee's Freedom of Information and Open Government Operations. She teaches both at the University of Maryland and American University, and formerly reported for the Des Moines Register. Please join me in giving these fellows a warm Washington and Lee round of applause. And so to tonight. I used to work with a terrific reporter named John Katzenbach. He covered federal courts for the Miami Herald. He went on to become an insanely successful journalist whose books have been made into many movies, big budget stuff with the likes of Bruce Willis, Colin Farrell, and Samuel L. Jackson. Katzenbach had a rule. He used to say, live your life so as to avoid cheap ironies. They're too easy. It's why you never change flights at the last minute. If anything happens, there you'll be in the lead of the disaster story. He hoped to get home to his ailing wife and baby daughter a few hours early, little could he know. So the rule was never make it easy for reporters to come up with the mindless lead that contains what appears to be some poignant and paradoxical fact that just, well, sums things up. When I invited our keynote speaker, I ignored the Katzenbach rule. And I've been the unaccustomed target of a certain amount of outrage and indignation, which seems unable to get beyond the rather obvious disconnect. Jayson Blair keynoting an ethics institute? Why not Osama bin Laden addressing B'nai B'rith? Or Bernie Madoff speaking to the Institute of Financial Planners? One particularly perturbed blogger with the Wall Street Journal suggested that maybe employers should not hire Washington Lee journalism grads. I wrote back that because I was intrigued by the somewhat medieval ethical notion that it would be just to punish students for the sins of their teachers, perhaps this blogger would like to keynote our next ethics institute. So before I introduce our speaker, I want to talk about this invitation on two levels. First, as a journalist. I'm in the business of helping train the next generation of journalists. Now, that's because regardless of what you may have heard, there will indeed be a next generation of journalists. And I have the privilege of working with some of them, and let me tell you, they're going to be even better than we were. And we were very good. And as journalists, their solemn calling will be to engage with and confront the people who are at the center of the major events of their time, not via email, but up close. Our speaker tonight is one such person. That's not to compliment him. That's to state a fact. So he's exactly the kind of person my kids should be prepared to engage and confront. Secondly, as an academic who specializes in professional ethics, I want to know as much as I can about what drives smart, idealistic people to transgress, to forego fundamental principles, to do things that are personally and institutionally destructive. Now, this is tricky stuff. When you talk about context, people naturally think you're trying to shift responsibility. Oh, it wasn't him, it was the toxic culture of the wicked New York Times. And that's not the point. But we do need to understand context. Institutions often unwittingly do aid and abet. To some degree, it does take a village. But we are also right to insist that this understanding of context may explain, but cannot absolve. What it can do instead is to appeal to our capacity for compassion and forgiveness. As I've had occasion to say, having Jayson Blair here is a departure for us. These institutes have almost invariably sought out heroes, people who exemplify the best, people like Hodding Carter and Helen Thomas, or who stood up to pressure like Matt Cooper and my colleague Tony Losi. But it's a departure for Jayson Blair, too, since he has largely kept silent about his bout with infamy since his book came out 5 years ago, and I hope he ends up glad he agreed to come. Now, before I give him a brief intro, a few program notes. Jayson is going to talk for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we're going to open the floor to questions, which he's eager to take. Now, I hope the media folk here don't take this wrong, but this is a university symposium. It's not a press conference, at least not initially. It's first and foremost intended for the students and faculty at W&L, for the community of Lexington, which we hope we serve. So when we go to questions, I would ask the media people to hold back. We want to hear from the civilian population. Jayson has agreed to take questions from the media afterward. If we run till 7 p.m., he'll be available thereafter for a press Q&A. And I'll ask the press folks here to come down toward the stage, and we'll continue. Non-media people will be welcome to stay, but I'll ask them at that point to let the reporters do their jobs. I hope that's okay. We're dedicated to training journalists, to journalism training, and the last thing I want to do is muzzle the press. One more point when we go to Q&A. This isn't a town meeting, at least not in the unfortunate sense that this term has acquired. If any of you has been preparing some fiery denunciation, save it for another time and place. We value civility here. That's not to say you need sacrifice, candor, and forthrightness, but I'm afraid too often our brothers and sisters in the media provide models of discourse that make it seem okay to be harsh and abusive, so please refrain. To our keynoter, Jayson Blair is from just up the road near Centerville, Virginia, and attended the University of Maryland. He was a 27-year-old reporter for the New York Times on March 11, 2003, when it was disclosed in a sensational front-page story that he had, quote, committed frequent acts of journalistic fraud while covering significant news events in recent months. The widespread fabrication and plagiarism represent a profound betrayal of trust and a low point in the 152-year history of the newspaper. The Times went on, quote, the reporter misled readers and Times colleagues with dispatches that purported to be from Maryland, Texas, and other states, when often he was far away in New York. He fabricated comments, he concocted scenes, he lifted material from other newspapers and wire services, he selected details from photographs to create the impression he had been somewhere or seen someone when he had not, unquote. The Times reporters assigned to sifting the debris found that of 73 stories Blair had written between October 2002 and May 2003, 36 had substantial problems. Like journalists elsewhere, the Times took this very hard. The paper's postmortem ran 7,000 words. It was published in its most widely circulated edition on a Sunday, and it started on page 1. By comparison, a year later, when the paper finally recognized that its pre-war coverage of weapons of mass destruction was badly flawed, the acknowledgement ran 1,100 words, not 7,000, was published on page A10 on a Wednesday. In the aftermath, simmering friction boiled over at the Times, and the two top editors of the newspaper, Howell Raines and Gerald Boyd, who was a keynoter at this very institute a few years ago, were forced to resign, and a wide-ranging reappraisal of management practices ensued. Indeed, to some observers, it looked as if the affair was like a blown tire that kept a high-performance car that was being handled recklessly from being driven over a cliff. So Jayson Blair, an energetic and talented and deeply troubled young man who longed to matter, ended up mattering in ways that he had not anticipated and, I suspect, never would have chosen. But that was then. Jayson is with us today. I read a profile of his reemergence as a life coach in the Washington Post in August. We got in touch, and here we are. Perhaps now he has a chance to matter in different ways and to rededicate himself to the possibility of making a difference for the better. But I'm here neither to praise Jayson Blair nor to bury him, but to present him in the hope that his story will contribute to the preservation of the profession of journalism, a profession that many of us love and all of us need. I give you Jayson Blair.
Thanks, Ed. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Are we good? Okay. It's always nice to visit the Shenandoah Valley. There are few parts of the world for me that are so beautiful, and few that have been home to such interesting people. When I was first approached about speaking at Washington and Lee, I was hesitant about reopening an old wound of mine and of the journalism profession. But I was convinced that there were more lessons to be learned from my experiences. I believe in what Robert E. Lee, a strong promoter of the journalism program at Washington and Lee, said when he came to the school as president after Appomattox. He said that it is the duty of all citizens to do all in their power to aid in the restoration and peace and harmony. I believe it is my duty, despite my new focus on psychological coaching and mental health causes, to do what I can to aid journalism students by providing them guidance on how to avoid the rocky roads that lead to ethical transgressions. My intention and my hope is that this will be my last public comment on journalism. I hope to reserve future conversations about my career in journalism to private audiences of students and for individuals who might be able to benefit from my experience, learn from my mistakes, and be inspired by my recovery. I am at peace with the knowledge that there's no one or nothing to blame for my troubles but myself. I have been accused of attempting to deflect blame for fabrication and plagiarism on the New York Times, the profession of journalism, illness, substances, race, and allotment of other people, places, and things. Those accusations of blame are as big untruths as the lies I told. I am here because of choices I made. It is in those choices that we find lessons to be learned. It is in those choices that we can find power to affect change. Understanding those choices has helped me better appreciate the human condition. Understanding those choices has helped me learn how I went from being a person who nobly pledged to comfort the afflicted and to seek the truth into a man who left some deep scars on his chosen profession. Understanding those choices may never make up for what happened, but it has the potential to help strengthen the profession. It's so deeply wounded. I recognize that I am but one of the voices that contribute to the lessons that can be learned from my experiences. I realize that I see my experience through a looking glass that provides great insight and great distortion. As the French author and moralist François de la Rochefoucauld said, "The defects and faults of the mind are like wounds to the body. After all imaginable care has been taken to heal them, still there will be a scar left behind." One of my favorite newspaper movies is the 1994 classic, The Paper. It's by Ron Howard. The movie is a comedy drama about a fictitious newspaper tabloid called the New York Sun. The movie stars Robert Duvall as the battle-worn editor-in-chief and Michael Keaton as the eager, young, workaholic Metro editor. Toward the end of the movie, Duvall's editor-in-chief character is sitting at a bar with Keaton's Metro editor character. Duvall's character asks a theoretical question of Keaton's character, whose wife is pregnant and who is asking him to spend less time at work. Let me give you a hypothetical the Duval character asks. A guy breaks into an apartment. He's got a gun, holds it to her head. He says, "I blow your wife's brain out," or "I blow up the Sun building. Choose. Now what do you say?" Keaton's character replies, "What do you think I say? It's ridiculous. It's not going to happen." And Duvall's character responds, "That's exactly my point. It's never one big dramatic choice. It's little vague situations every day. And you're either there or you're not. If you keep waiting for the guy with the gun to show up, it'll be too late." Duvall knew his character was divorced. His daughter wouldn't speak to him. All he had was the paper. Now, while the focus of this story is about how a noble family man slowly transforms into a workaholic who loses his family, it's an instructive lesson about choices. Rarely are our choices in life presented as a major dramatic question. If they were, it would be easy. If I had been asked one day whether I wanted to destroy my career, trash my profession, and undermine belief in journalism, I would have unambiguously declined regardless of the potential benefits. But life's difficult choices rarely present themselves in one dramatic question or one big decision. Instead, our most important choices in life, including ethical ones, present themselves in small baby steps, one step at a time, in minor choices that may not even seem related to the ultimate outcome. And then one day, like the workaholic who loses his wife or his daughter's love, you can turn around and find yourself close or across a line that you never thought you would go anywhere near. I see this pattern every day in the lives of people who arrive in my office at Ashburn Psychological Service, a mental health practice in Northern Virginia where I now work. I see it in my own life, both as a journalist and in other areas. One of the first questions journalism students usually ask me is about why I got into the profession. They can at times have a hard time swallowing the notion that I got into the profession because I was curious, loved writing, and wanted to help people. My reasons sound as noble as their own, and this can create some cognitive dissonance. I think it's hard for people to process the idea, to internalize the notion that I once was so much like them. But it's an important premise in looking at my career. Because if you buy the idea that I became a journalist for such noble reasons and that I could cross the ethical lines that I did, you can buy the notion that you can. As FBI profilers and forensic psychiatrists will tell you, recognizing that anyone is capable, under the right circumstances, of anything is the first step in guarding against the evil from within. I had been curious and interested in writing as long as I can remember. I became interested in journalism as a high school student, when I learned that newspapers could help people. I can still remember the stories in the Washington Post and our local newspapers that propelled me into the profession. One was about the life and death of a student who had been my friend. I saw the healing power of journalism. Another was about a classmate whose insurance company had denied medical treatment for anorexia nervosa that had left her hospitalized and turned her into a dying skeleton. I saw the helping power of journalism when thousands of dollars were raised and the girl's insurance company reversed its decision because of the bad publicity. I began writing for the high school newspaper and spent the summer after my senior year at a local community weekly. I followed that with enrollment at the University of Maryland, where I wrote for the daily newspaper that I would become the editor of years later. I was taught by greats like Haddon Carter and Reese Cleghorn. In between, I had internships at the Washington Times, the Washington Post, the Washington Bureau of the Boston Globe, the Metro section of the Globe. This experience led to my being hired in 1998 as a summer intern at the New York Times. I was a part of a magical class of Times interns. Talented reporters like Ed Wong and Macarena Hernandez, amazing photographers, graphic designers, and editors. We were mentored by the best and expected that only one of us would be offered a position at the end of the 10-week internship. In the end, the majority of us were selected to return to the paper, although a few of those chose to pursue other options. In the path that led me to the Times, you can begin to see the underpinnings of what contributed to my ethical failings. I entered the profession to help people, and then became convinced that to help the most people, I had to have the greatest impact on their lives. And to have the greatest impact, I needed to work at one of the best newspapers. Later, I became convinced, once I accepted a position at that great paper, that I needed to have the best beat to make the most impact. Somewhere along the way, on my way of climbing upwards, I lost sight of the very reason that I entered journalism. Once that underpinning was lost, I was anchorless, talented and hardworking to be sure. I was climbing aimlessly without the moral navigation system that had guided me earlier. No one came to my door with a gun and asked whether I wanted to shoot journalism. It was not so simple. And I must greatly emphasize that at the core, I am to blame for my choices. There are a number of confounding factors that in some ways contributed to creating an environment ripe for my ethical transgressions. I was at the newspaper at a time when we had a new editor who put a much greater emphasis on speed and impact. I'm sure that this editor did not intentionally decide to sacrifice accuracy. And in fact, he said that he believed that we could do things faster and more powerfully with the same amount of accuracy. However, the focus on speed and impact had an ultimate result of sacrificing some accuracy through a flood-the-zone philosophy that reallocated resources and left less time being devoted to the reporting, writing, and editing of each story. This likely contributed to other problems that the paper had during that time period. An additional confounding factor was the battle fatigue at the times following the September 11 attacks. We were emotionally in the midst of a never-ending marathon that had taken a cumulative toll on our editors and our reporters. It was in this environment that I recall first crossing the line. Once it was crossed, like so much else in ethics and other areas of life, it was so much easier to cross again. An additional factor involves my own personal struggles, which are not very relevant to the journalistic lessons that can be learned. I have discussed my struggles with mental illness and substance abuse elsewhere, and will not dwell on them here. But suffice to say that my recovery from alcohol and drug abuse, while life-changing in a positive way, was the harbinger leading the way for the intensified presentation of mental health symptoms that added fuel to a fire that was initially ignited by my character flaws, allowing it to burn brighter and perhaps longer. One of the major problems with the instruction of ethics is that the focus is often more greatly on the best practices when we can learn the most from the worst practices, which set firm boundaries and teach us how good people end up doing bad things. If we merely believe that only bad people do bad things, then you good people have no reason to learn ethics at all, for you are destined to do good no matter what happens. This seems contrary to everything we know about the human condition. I would like to address, before beginning our discussion, my feelings about the Times. It's a wonderful newspaper whose editors came to my rescue on the day of my resignation. They responded with human kindness by emptying the newsroom to find me, to make sure that I was safe, and to get me the medical attention they assumed I needed. I continue to be very grateful for them. Thank you all very much for listening. At this point, I think we're going to start the question and answer session, and there are a number of topics, obviously, either that I didn't go into detail about. Feel free to follow up. Feel free to ask any question about any particular topic, whether I touched on it or not.